The courtroom was cold that September morning in Denver when Judge Harrison delivered the verdict that would change everything. I sat in the back row, my hands clenched so tight my knuckles turned white, watching as my father David stood before the judge in his orange jumpsuit. 5 years. That's what they gave him for what he did to my stepfather Marcus. 5 years for protecting me, for believing me when no one else would, for doing what he thought was the only way to keep me safe. As the gavel came down with that final, devastating sound, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I decided to stop telling the truth. My mother, Sarah, cried the entire drive home from the courthouse, her mascara running in dark rivers down her cheeks, while Marcus stroked her face with a gentleness that made my skin crawl. She kept repeating through her sobs that everything would be okay now, that we could finally be a normal family again. I pressed myself against the car door, as far from them as I could get, watching the familiar streets of our neighborhood pass by through the rain-streaked window. When we pulled into our driveway on Maple Street, the house I'd grown up in suddenly looked like a prison. Sarah turned to look at me from the front seat, her eyes red and swollen, and said she needed some time to process everything that had happened. She was going to stay with her friend Patricia for a few days, just to clear her head and figure out how to move forward. The way she said it, like it was perfectly reasonable to abandon your 16-year-old daughter with the man who had just sent her father to prison, made something break inside me. I reached out and grabbed her arm as she started to get out of the car, my fingers digging into her skin with desperation I couldn't hide. "Please don't leave me alone with him," I begged, my voice cracking on the words. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. The sound echoed in the confined space of the car, and my cheek burned with the force of it. "Your father filled your head with lies," she hissed at me, her face twisted with an anger I'd never seen before. "Marcus has been nothing but good to us, and you destroyed our family with your stories." I sat there stunned, my hand pressed to my stinging cheek, as she got out of the car and slammed the door. An hour later, I watched from my bedroom window as Sarah loaded every suitcase we owned into her Toyota Camry. She moved with frantic energy, like she couldn't get away fast enough, throwing clothes and toiletries into bags without folding anything properly. Marcus helped her carry the heavier bags, playing the part of the concerned husband perfectly, occasionally glancing up at my window with an expression I couldn't read. When the car was finally loaded, Sarah stood by the driver's door for a moment, looking up at the house like she was saying goodbye to it forever. Then she got in and drove away without looking back. The moment her taillights disappeared around the corner, I heard Marcus's footsteps on the stairs. They were slow and deliberate, each creak of the old wooden steps sending a fresh wave of panic through my body. I backed away from my bedroom door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps stopped right outside my room, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then I heard the sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. The click of the deadbolt on our front door echoing through the house, followed by the jingle of keys as Marcus put them in his pocket. The doorknob to my room turned slowly, and Marcus stood there in the doorway, his 6'2" frame blocking out the hallway light. His eyes, those cold gray eyes that Sarah always said were so kind, ran along my body in a way that made me want to disappear into the walls. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at me like a snake studying a mouse, calculating the best way to strike. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and reasonable, the same tone he used when talking to Sarah's friends at dinner parties. "We need to talk about what you told your father," he said, stepping into my room and closing the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded final, like the closing of a coffin lid. I was already backing toward the window, my mind racing through escape routes and possibilities. He took another step forward and I bolted, trying to dart past him toward the door. His hand shot out faster than I expected, catching my ankle as I tried to leap over his outstretched leg. I went down hard, my elbow cracking against the hardwood floor, and kicked backwards with everything I had. My heel connected with something soft, and I heard him grunt in pain as I scrambled to my feet. I made it to my bedroom door and slammed it shut, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. The old lock wouldn't hold him for long, I knew that, so I grabbed the heavy oak wardrobe that had belonged to my grandmother and started dragging it across the floor. The furniture scraped against the hardwood with a sound like screaming, and I pushed with all my strength until it was wedged against the door. My next thought was the window. I ran to it and tried to lift the sash, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I saw them. The screws drilled through the frame into the wood, painted over to match so you wouldn't notice unless you were looking closely. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me. He'd been planning this. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision after Sarah left. He'd prepared my room like a cell, knowing that someday he'd have me alone. The sound of a power drill starting up somewhere in the house made my blood run cold. The high-pitched whine of it seemed to fill every corner of my room, and I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to think through the panic. The drill sound was getting closer, coming up the stairs now with those same deliberate footsteps. I could hear him humming something under his breath, some old song I couldn't place, like he was doing home repairs on a lazy Sunday afternoon instead of stalking a terrified teenager. The drilling sound stopped right outside my door, and I heard the scrape of metal on wood as he worked on something I couldn't see. Every few seconds, the drill would start again, and I could feel the vibrations through the floor. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sound stopped, and his footsteps moved away down the hall. I waited, counting my breaths, before carefully moving the wardrobe just enough to try the door. It wouldn't budge, not even a millimeter. He'd installed something on the outside, some kind of lock or bar that made my bedroom door as secure as a bank vault. His voice drifted through the door, sing-song and playful in a way that made bile rise in my throat. "We have 3 days, Emily. 3 whole days to teach you what happens to little girls who tell lies about their stepfathers. 3 days before your mother comes back and finds her daughter finally understands how to behave properly." The footsteps moved away, and I heard his bedroom door close down the hall. I tore through my closet like a hurricane, throwing clothes and shoes aside, searching for anything that might help me escape or defend myself. In the back corner, buried under a pile of winter sweaters I never wore, I found my old Chromebook that I'd gotten for my 13th birthday. My hands shook as I opened it and waited for it to power on. The battery was low, only 12%, but the Wi-Fi connected immediately. I opened Discord with trembling fingers and found my best friend Jessica online. The message I typed was short and desperate. "Marcus locked me in my room. He's going to hurt me. Please help." The typing indicator appeared immediately, showing Jessica was responding. Her message popped up a second later. "Is this about your dad? You promised you wouldn't tell anyone what really happened." Before I could type a response to explain that this was different, that I was in actual danger right now, the screen went black. Not just the laptop, but every electronic device in my room. The alarm clock, the overhead light, even the little LED on my phone charger. He'd cut the power to my room. I sat in the sudden darkness, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light filtering through the window from the street lamps outside. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. I was trapped in my own bedroom with no power, no way to communicate with the outside world, and no one who knew I was in danger. Sarah thought I was a liar who had destroyed our family. Jessica thought I was being dramatic. And my father, the only person who had believed me, was sitting in a cell where he couldn't help anyone. The old house settled around me with creaks and groans I'd never noticed before. Every sound made me jump, wondering if it was Marcus coming back. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand, a heavy ceramic thing painted with roses that Sarah had bought at an estate sale. The weight of it in my hands gave me a tiny bit of comfort, something solid I could use to defend myself if I had to. Then I looked at the window again, at those screws mocking me with their permanence, and made a decision. I swung the lamp at the window with every ounce of strength I had. The crash was tremendous, glass exploding outward in a shower of glittering shards. Immediately, an alarm started screaming through the house, the kind of piercing wail that made your teeth hurt. I didn't care about the noise, didn't care about anything except getting out. I used the base of the lamp to clear away the remaining glass from the frame, creating an opening just big enough for me to fit through. Behind me, I could hear Marcus slamming his body against my bedroom door. The wardrobe shuddered with each impact, scooting forward inch by inch across the floor. He was laughing between the crashes, this deep belly laugh like a mall Santa Claus gone wrong. "Come on out, Emily," he called through the door. "You know you can't hide from me forever. Let's talk about this like adults." I didn't wait to hear more. I climbed onto the windowsill, careful to avoid the remaining glass, and looked down at the narrow ledge that ran along the second story of our house. It was maybe 6 inches wide, covered in old leaves and bird droppings, but it was my only chance. I turned sideways and stepped out onto it, my back pressed against the rough siding of the house, trying not to look down at the concrete patio 15 feet below. The bedroom door crashed open behind me with a sound like thunder. I couldn't see him from my position, but I could hear him cursing as he realized I'd gone out the window. "Move faster," I told myself, inching along the ledge toward the bathroom window 10 feet away. My fingers found tiny gaps in the siding to hold on to, and I tried to control my breathing. Tried not to think about what would happen if I fell. Marcus's face appeared in my bedroom window, his gray eyes wild with something that might have been rage or excitement. "There you are," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "You're going to hurt yourself out there, sweetheart. Why don't you come back inside where it's safe?" He started to climb out after me, but his larger frame made it awkward, and I used his moment of struggle to move faster along the ledge. The bathroom window was smaller than my bedroom window, but it was also older, with a simple latch instead of screws. I made it there just as Marcus got himself fully onto the ledge. My fingers fumbled with the latch, which was stiff from years of paint and lack of use. Come on," I whispered, putting all my weight behind it. The latch finally gave way with a pop, and I shoved the window up with both hands. I dove through head first, not caring about grace or safety, just needing to get inside before Marcus could grab me. I hit the bathroom tile hard, my shoulder taking most of the impact, and scrambled to my feet. The bathroom door had a lock, an old push-button thing that probably wouldn't hold him for long, but I engaged it anyway. Then I looked around the small space, trying to find another way out. The bathroom had one tiny window above the toilet, the kind that was more for ventilation than escape. But I was small for my age, and desperate people can fit through spaces you wouldn't think possible. I climbed onto the toilet tank, my shoes slipping on the porcelain, and examined the window. It was maybe 18 inches square, with a simple crank mechanism to open it. Marcus hit the bathroom door like a freight train. The whole frame shuddered, and I could see the wood starting to splinter around the lock. "I tried to be patient while your dad ruined everything." He screamed through the door, his reasonable facade finally cracking completely. But patience doesn't work with lying little girls who don't appreciate everything I've done for this family. I cranked the little window open as far as it would go and started to squeeze through. My head and shoulders made it, but my hips got stuck in the frame. Behind me, the bathroom door exploded inward with a crack like a gunshot. Marcus's hands grabbed my ankles and started pulling me back. I screamed and clawed at the window frame, feeling my fingernails bend backward and break against the wood. The pain was sharp and immediate, but adrenaline pushed it to the background. He pulled harder, lifting my feet off the toilet tank, and for a moment I was suspended in the air, half in and half out of the window. Then his hands, slick with sweat, lost their grip. I slipped through the window like I'd been shot from a cannon, falling into the thorny rose bushes Sarah had planted below. The thorns tore through my clothes and skin, leaving burning lines of pain across my arms and legs. But I was outside. I was free. I forced myself to stand, ignoring the way my ankle protested when I put weight on it. Looking back at the house, I saw Marcus walking calmly out the front door, like he had all the time in the world. His hand was in his jacket pocket, wrapped around something I couldn't see but could guess at. He knew I couldn't run fast with my injured ankle. He knew the neighbors were used to hearing our family's drama. He knew he could catch me, but he didn't know about Mrs. Chen. Our neighbor across the street was a retired emergency room nurse who missed nothing that happened on our quiet street. Her porch light flicked on as I limped across her lawn, and her front door opened before I could even knock. She took one look at me, bleeding and disheveled with torn clothes and wild eyes, and pulled me inside without a word. "Help," I gasped, collapsing onto her hardwood floor. He locked me in my room. "He's going to hurt me. Please call 911. Mrs. Chen was already reaching for her phone, but then Marcus appeared on her porch, that concerned stepfather mask sliding perfectly back into place. His voice through the door was sweet and apologetic, explaining how I'd been having episodes since my father went to prison, how I'd been hurting myself and making up stories for attention. "Mrs. Chen, I'm so sorry about this," he said, and I could picture his sad smile even though I couldn't see his face. She's been having such a hard time. Her mother warned me she might try something like this. We've been trying to get her the help she needs, but she keeps refusing treatment. He pulled out his phone and showed it through the window. Dozens of text messages, supposedly from my mother, filling the screen. I tried to protest, tried to tell Mrs. Chen they were fake, but she was already helping Marcus lift me up. Her face had gone from concerned to sympathetic in a way that made my heart sink. "Sweetheart, you're bleeding everywhere," she said gently. "Let's get you home and cleaned up. Your parents can sort this out." I wanted to scream that he wasn't my parent, that he was a monster wearing a human mask, but the words wouldn't come. Marcus carried me back across the street like I weighed nothing, his arms iron bands around my body. Mrs. Chen followed us to the door, suggesting we call my mother right away. Maybe take me to see the doctor she'd recommended. Marcus thanked her profusely, promised to get me the help I needed, and gently closed the door in her face. The moment the lock clicked, his mask dropped again. He set me on the couch, almost gently, and went to get the first aid kit from under the kitchen sink. I sat there frozen, watching him move around the house like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just chased me across window ledges and through rose bushes. When he came back, he knelt in front of me and started cleaning the cuts on my hands with alcohol that burned like liquid fire. I bit my lip to keep from crying out, not wanting to give him the satisfaction. "You're going to keep quiet from now on," he said conversationally, like we were discussing the weather. "No one's going to believe you anyway. Your mom thinks you're crazy. Your friend thinks you're a liar. Even nice Mrs. Chen thinks you need psychiatric help." He reached under the couch and his hand came back holding a length of rope, the kind you'd use for camping or clotheslines. 3 days is a long time, Emily. We need to make sure you don't hurt yourself again." He grabbed my wrists and started wrapping the rope around them, but something inside me snapped. I bit down on his hand as hard as I could, tasting copper and salt as my teeth broke through skin. He jerked back with a curse, blood running between his fingers, and stumbled backward. I scrambled away from him across the couch, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. For a second, he just stared at the bite marks on his hand with an expression of genuine shock. Blood dripped onto Sarah's cream-colored carpet, and I had the absurd thought that she'd be furious about the stains. Then his face shifted through a series of emotions, rage, calculation, and finally settling on something cold and controlled that scared me more than his anger ever could. He wrapped his bleeding hand in his shirt, the white fabric blooming red like roses. "We need to talk about boundaries and consequences," he said in that reasonable voice again, like I was a misbehaving child who needed a timeout. I nodded quickly, making my voice as small and defeated as possible. "I understand. I'll listen. I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't hurt me." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but I could see him relaxing slightly, buying into my performance of submission. He sat down in Sarah's reading chair across from me, still holding his injured hand against his shirt. I watched the way his shoulders stayed tense despite his calm voice, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched rhythmically. He started talking about respect and trust and how families need to work together. It was like listening to a parenting podcast hosted by a sociopath, all the right words in all the wrong contexts. While he delivered his rehearsed speech about healthy family dynamics, he picked up his phone from the coffee table. He dialed Sarah's number and put it on speaker, a move clearly designed to show me how isolated I was. She answered on the second ring, her voice already shaky with fresh tears. Marcus told her I was having another episode, that I'd attacked him and hurt myself trying to break windows. I could hear her crying harder as he described my behavior in terms that made me sound like a rabid animal. I tried to yell that he was lying, that none of it was true, but he talked right over me in a louder voice, describing my hysteria to Sarah like a doctor discussing a patient's symptoms. He suggested I might need inpatient treatment, somewhere with proper monitoring and medication management. Sarah's voice broke as she agreed, saying she'd stay with Patricia for a few more days to give me space to calm down. That's when the final piece clicked into place. They had planned this together. Maybe not the specifics, but Sarah had known he would do something to break me while she was gone, and she had left anyway. After he hung up, I sat there shaking so hard my teeth chattered. Everything hurt. my hands, my ankle, my heart. But I forced myself to think tactically, to push through the panic and find some kind of plan. I told him my hand really hurt and I needed to use the bathroom, making my voice weak and pathetic. He studied me for a long moment, those gray eyes searching for deception, before nodding. He followed me to the bathroom and stood right outside the door, which wouldn't quite latch properly. Through the gap, I could see his shadow, could hear his breathing. While I was in there, I spotted a tiny shard of glass on the floor near the shower, probably from my earlier escape attempt. I palmed it carefully, feeling the edges bite into my skin, and tucked it into my sock. It wasn't much, but it was something sharp, something he didn't know I had. When I came out, Marcus walked me back upstairs, showing me the new lock he'd installed on my bedroom door. It was a heavy-duty deadbolt with a key that he made a show of putting in his pocket. He explained very casually that I'd be staying in my room for the next 3 days until I learned my lesson about lying and causing trouble. The way he said 3 days, with such specific certainty, made it clear he'd thought through every detail of this imprisonment. The moment he locked me in, I pulled out the glass shard and got to work. I crawled under my dresser and used it to scratch a message into the wood. The date, the time, and the words locked from outside by Marcus in tiny, desperate letters. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be evidence. Proof that this wasn't all in my head like everyone seemed to think. Hours passed in the darkness of my room. I sat on my bed trying not to panic, trying to think of what David, my real father, would do in this situation. He was a Marine before he met my mother, always talking about tactical thinking and situational awareness. What would he tell me? Observe your enemy. Learn his patterns. Find his weaknesses. Use every resource available. When Marcus finally opened the door again, he brought a sandwich and water, setting the tray just inside the door while watching me carefully. He asked questions about what exactly I'd told David, probing for details about our conversations. I gave him what he wanted to hear, admitting that I'd made everything up because I was angry about the divorce, that David had believed my lies because he wanted to hurt Marcus. The words burned coming out, but I could see Marcus relaxing with each lie I told. After he left, locking me in again, I waited until his footsteps faded before searching my desk drawers. I found an old pen with just enough ink left to write on my palm. Help locked in, I wrote in shaky letters that I hoped would be readable. It was a small thing, but if I got another chance to signal someone, I wanted to be ready. The afternoon dragged on, and I listened to the sounds of the house through the heating vent in my floor. Marcus was downstairs on the phone, his voice carrying up through the ductwork. He was talking to the alarm company, explaining that his stepdaughter had accidentally triggered the system, that everything was fine now, no need to send anyone out. His voice was so normal, so reasonable that it made my skin crawl. This man who had chased me across window ledges was chatting with customer service like any other suburban stepfather. As evening approached, I started paying attention to Marcus's movement patterns. Every hour or so, he would walk past my door, the floorboards creaking in a specific sequence. Left foot, right foot, pause at my door, continue to his room. He was checking on me, making sure I was still locked in, still under his control. I memorized the pattern, the timing, filing it away with all the other observations I was collecting. That night, I discovered something that gave me a spark of hope. The heating vent in my floor connected to other rooms in the house. If I pressed my ear against it, I could hear Marcus in his room. And more importantly, he was recording something on his phone. He was practicing different explanations for my behavior, rehearsing stories about my mental health issues, my history of self-harm, my tendency to make false accusations. He recorded the same lies over and over, adjusting his tone each time until he found the perfect balance of concern and frustration. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through my broken window. The house was quiet, but I could hear Marcus moving around downstairs, making coffee, acting like this was any other day. I went back to the window and examined the screws again, confirming what I already knew. There was no way to remove them without tools I didn't have. But the broken glass had given me an idea. I tore a page from my old notebook and wrote a message in the biggest letters I could manage. Help locked in. Call police. I folded it into a tight square and waited. When Marcus let me out for my morning bathroom break, I climbed onto the toilet tank and tossed the note through the small window, aiming for Mrs. Chen's yard. I watched it land in her bushes near her back door and prayed she would find it before the wind blew it away. Marcus brought me breakfast, pleased by how compliant I was being. I asked quietly for some ice for my injured hand, playing up the pain, making myself seem weak and defeated. He brought me an ice pack in a plastic bag, and while he watched, I slipped a second tiny note into the seam of the bag. These breadcrumbs of evidence were all I could manage, but I scattered them everywhere I could think of. That afternoon, I tried something risky. I grabbed a towel from my closet and used it to partially block the heating vent, creating just enough heat buildup to trigger the smoke detector. The alarm beeped, and Marcus came running up the stairs. I watched through the crack under my door as he checked the detector, reset it, and then did something unexpected. He sat down in the hallway outside my door and started showing me his phone screen through the gap. "Look at these texts from your mother," he said, angling the screen so I could see. The messages were supposedly from Sarah, talking about how worried she was about my mental state, how she thought I needed professional help, how she was afraid I might hurt myself or others. But I noticed things wrong with them. The timestamp showed they were all sent within the same minute. Sarah never used your when she meant your. She was obsessive about grammar, always correcting my texts. These messages were fake, and I memorized every error, every inconsistency. A few hours later, I heard his truck start in the driveway. My heart leapt with hope. Was he actually leaving? I rushed to test my door, but it was still locked solid. Through my window, I watched him pull out and drive away. 20 minutes later, he was back, carrying bags from the hardware store. He unloaded zip ties, duct tape, and other supplies that made my stomach turn to ice. This wasn't over. Whatever he had planned for the remaining time required supplies. When Mrs. Chen knocked on our door that evening, I thought my prayers had been answered. Maybe she'd found one of my notes. I pressed against my bedroom door, straining to hear their conversation. Marcus intercepted her at the front door, his voice smooth and friendly. I managed to angle myself so that for just a second, I could flash my palm with help locked, still faintly visible through the gap under my door. But Marcus shifted, blocking her view, and I didn't know if she'd seen anything. After she left, Marcus's footsteps stopped outside my room. His voice was cold when he told me I'd earned myself a punishment for trying to signal the neighbor. I heard him go to the utility closet, and then came the distinctive sound of the water valve turning. He'd shut off the water to my bathroom. The half-full water bottle on my nightstand suddenly seemed very precious. That night, while Marcus watched TV downstairs, I put my escape plan into action. I'd been working on the bed slats, applying careful pressure to find the weakest one. It finally snapped with a sound I muffled against my mattress. The piece of wood wasn't much, maybe 2 feet long, but it was solid enough to use as a tool. I hid it under my mattress and waited. Marcus had started dozing on the couch downstairs. I could tell by the rhythm of his breathing, which I could hear through the heating vent. He would sleep for about 40 minutes before his phone alarm went off at 3:30 a.m. Some kind of reminder he'd set, though I didn't know what for. This was my window of opportunity. Using my makeshift pry bar, I worked on the door hinges from the inside. They were old, painted over multiple times, and the pins were slightly loose. It took 2 hours of careful, silent work, but I managed to loosen them enough that I could lift the door slightly. The gap at the top wasn't much, maybe 4 inches, but I thought I could squeeze through if I had to. The next morning brought a new development. Marcus's phone rang, and through the vent I heard my mother's voice. She was crying, saying she couldn't do this anymore, begging him not to make her choose between us. The words hit me like a physical blow. Choose? She had already chosen. She'd chosen him the moment she packed those suitcases and left me here. But hearing her frame it as some impossible decision made me realize how completely she'd rewritten reality in her mind. I pulled out a few strands of my hair, one at a time so it wouldn't be noticeable, and slid them under the door gap. I blew gently and watched them move with the air current. The hallway was drafty, which meant air was moving from somewhere. I tested different spots along the door and found the widest gap was near the hinge side. Every piece of information felt important, even if I didn't know how I'd use it yet. Before sunrise on the 3rd day, I heard the power drill again. Marcus was installing something above my door frame. When he stepped back, I could see it through the crack. A security camera with a blinking red light pointed right at my door. But something was off about it. The red light wasn't actually blinking, it was just reflecting the hallway light. There was no power cord, no cable running to a recorder. It was fake, a psychological trick to make me think I was being watched even when he wasn't there. When he let me out for my bathroom break that morning, I put another plan into motion. While the water ran to cover the sound, I used my glass shard to work on one of the screws holding the window screen. The threads were stripped from age and weather, and after what felt like forever, it came loose. I palmed the screw, feeling its sharp threads against my skin. The screen was loose now on one corner. If I could get the other screws out, I might be able to remove it entirely. Back in my room, I examined my collection of small weapons and tools. A glass shard, a loose screw, a broken bed slat. Messages scratched into wood and skin. Hair tucked into crevices. Notes thrown into yards. None of it seemed like much, but together they represented hours of planning, of refusing to give up. David would be proud, I thought. He'd taught me to be a fighter, even when the odds seemed impossible. That afternoon, everything changed. Marcus was on the phone downstairs, and his voice had an edge of real worry to it. He was talking about a welfare check, complaining about nosy neighbors who didn't mind their own business. Someone had called the authorities. Maybe Mrs. Chen had seen something after all, or maybe one of my notes had been found. Either way, people were starting to ask questions. 2 hours later, I saw the police cruiser pull up outside. This was it. This was my chance. I started banging on the floor with both fists, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. But Marcus was ready. The TV downstairs suddenly blasted at maximum volume, some action movie with explosions and gunfire that drowned out everything else. I kept screaming anyway, pounding until my hands went numb. But after 10 minutes, I watched the police car drive away. Marcus's footsteps on the stairs were slow and deliberate. He stopped outside my door but didn't say anything. The weight of his presence, his silence, was more threatening than any words could have been. Then he walked away, and the TV volume returned to normal. The message was clear. No one was coming to save me. I was on my own. That night, I wrote everything down on a piece of paper I found in my desk. Every detail, every timestamp, every piece of evidence I'd hidden. I used the tiniest handwriting possible to fit it all on one page. When Marcus let me out for the bathroom, I pushed the folded note through the gap under the window, watching it float down toward Mrs. Chen's recycling bins. It landed perfectly, right where she'd see it when she took out the trash. But the next time I saw the bins, my heart sank. There was my note, crumpled up with junk mail and newspapers. She'd thrown it away without reading it. All that effort, all that hope, literally in the trash. I wanted to cry, but there wasn't time for that. Because I heard Marcus's truck turning onto our street, and I knew my bathroom break was almost over. He came back with pharmacy bags, and through the gap under my door, I could see him favoring his left hand. The bite wound must have gotten infected. He was muttering to himself about antiseptic cream and proper bandages. This was my chance. When he told me he was going out for 20 minutes to get medical supplies, I could hear the pain and frustration in his voice. He set extra locks on my door, warning me he'd know if I tried anything. The moment his truck faded into the distance, I sprang into action. Using my bed slat, I leveraged the door up from its loosened hinges. It was heavier than I'd expected, and my arms shook with the effort. But desperation gives you strength you didn't know you had. The gap widened to 4 inches, then 6, then 8. I dropped the slat and grabbed the top of the door frame, pulling myself up and through the gap like I was doing the world's most terrifying pull-up. I scraped skin off on the rough wood and probably left blood on the door frame, but I was out. I was in the hallway. I ran to the bathroom and used a wire coat hanger to scrape paint off the window latch until it finally moved. The window was tiny, maybe 18 inches square, but I'd gotten good at fitting through impossible spaces. I went through head first, twisting my body at angles that would hurt later, and tumbled onto the roof overhang below. The shingles were rough and hot from the sun, and I slid down faster than I'd intended. Then I was falling, crashing into the bushes with the impact that knocked the wind out of me. Thorns tore new cuts in my skin, but I forced myself to stand and run. I had to get to Mrs. Chen's house before Marcus came back. I burst through her gate and ran to her recycling bin, my heart sinking when I saw my notes still there with the trash. She'd never seen them. Never knew I was trying to reach her. But there was no time to dwell on that because I could hear Marcus's truck turning onto our street. I had seconds, maybe less. I banged on Mrs. Chen's door with the pattern we'd used when I was little, when she'd babysit me and we'd play secret agent games. 3 fast, 2 slow, 3 fast. Our secret code. The door opened and I shoved my arm in her face. The injury map I'd drawn was still there, timestamps and locations marked in fading pen. "Help," I gasped. He locked me in. "Call 911 now." Mrs. Chen's expression shifted from confusion to horror as she took in my appearance. The cuts, the bruises, the desperation in my eyes. She pulled me inside and locked the door, already reaching for her phone. Through her front window, I saw Marcus's truck pull up to our house. He got out slowly, looking at my broken bedroom window, and I saw the moment he realized I was gone. The 911 dispatcher's voice filled Mrs. Chen's kitchen as she explained the situation. Her neighbor's stepdaughter had just escaped from being locked in her room. The girl was injured and terrified. "Please send help immediately." I took the phone with shaking hands and forced myself to speak clearly, to give them the details they needed. The exterior deadbolt, the power being cut to my room, the 3 days he'd said we had. Marcus knocked on Mrs. Chen's door, his voice carrying that same reasonable tone he'd perfected. "My stepdaughter is confused," he called through the wood. "She needs her medication. She's been having episodes." Mrs. Chen looked at me and I shook my head frantically. She walked to the door but kept the chain on, telling him the police were already on their way and he should wait at his own house. When 2 police cars pulled up, I thought I might collapse from relief. Real help. Real officers who would see the evidence, who would believe me. One officer stayed with me while the other went to check the house. I showed them my injuries, the rope burns on my wrists, the injury map on my arm. I told them about the exterior lock, the fake text messages, the voice recordings Marcus had made. Detective Logan Reeves arrived shortly after, introducing himself as the one who'd handled the welfare check earlier. His questions were detailed and professional. He didn't act like I was being dramatic or making things up. He photographed every injury, every piece of evidence I showed him. When I told him about the messages I'd scratched under the dresser, about the hair I'd hidden under the bathroom baseboard, he nodded approvingly. "This kind of documentation is really helpful for building a case," he said, and I felt like all my careful planning had been worth it. We went back to the house together, Marcus's truck notably absent from the driveway. The officers documented everything. The exterior deadbolt, the broken window with glass still on the floor, the loosened door hinges showing my escape route. They carefully moved my dresser and photographed the message I'd scratched into the floor. At the hospital, a nurse named Beth documented every single injury with the thoroughness of someone who'd done this too many times before. She measured the rope burns, photographed the glass cuts, noted the pattern of bruises on my ankles. Each injury got its own detailed description, its own series of photos from multiple angles. She was gentle but efficient, treating my body like the crime scene it had become. A victim's advocate named Angela Flores came to talk to me about what would happen next. She explained the investigation process, the possibility of criminal charges, the reality of CPS involvement. She talked about safety planning and protective orders in a calm, clear way that helped me feel less lost in the system. When I tried calling my mother and got voicemail, Angela helped me craft a message that was factual rather than emotional. That night, in a hotel room paid for by victim services, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about patterns. How Marcus had planned everything so carefully. How my mother had enabled him by leaving. How the system had almost failed me because abusers like Marcus know exactly how to manipulate it. But I'd found my own patterns too. The pattern of evidence leaving. The pattern of never giving up. The pattern of fighting back even when everyone thought I was lying. The blocked calls started the next morning, 3 in a row that I didn't answer. Angela had warned me this might happen, that Marcus might try to contact me. Each time the phone rang, I documented it, took screenshots, saved everything. Evidence. Always evidence. Because I'd learned that in a world where teenage girls aren't always believed, documentation could be the difference between justice and becoming just another statistic. CPS caseworker Phyllis Matthews called at exactly 8:30 a.m., her questions clinical and thorough. Where had I been living? Who else was in the home? Did I have other family who could take me? I answered everything as clearly as I could, even though talking about my mother's abandonment made my chest feel tight. The word neglect felt both too small and too big for what had happened. Detective Reeves called with an update that made my stomach drop. Marcus had provided what he claimed were text messages from me admitting I'd made everything up. But when I agreed to let their tech team examine my phone to verify metadata and prove the messages were fake, I could hear the approval in his voice. Liars don't volunteer their phones for forensic examination. The affidavit I wrote with Angela's help was 12 pages long. Every detail I could remember, every timestamp I could verify, every piece of evidence I'd hidden or created. As I signed my name at the bottom, I thought about that moment in the courtroom when I'd decided to stop telling the truth. How that decision had led me here, to this moment where the truth was all I had left. 3 weeks later, Marcus was arrested on charges of unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment, and assault. The forensic team had not only proven his text messages were fabricated, but had recovered the voice recordings from his phone where he'd practiced his lies. The exterior deadbolt, still in evidence bags, became the prosecution's key exhibit. You can't claim a child is having mental health episodes when you've literally locked them in their room from the outside. My mother finally surfaced after Marcus's arrest, full of tears and apologies and explanations about how she never meant for things to go so far. I sat across from her in the supervised visitation room, looking at this woman who had chosen to believe a monster over her own daughter, and felt nothing but pity. She'd lost everything. Her husband in prison, her boyfriend arrested, her daughter in foster care, all because she couldn't face the truth about the men she chose. The trial took 8 months. I testified for 3 hours, walking the jury through those 3 days moment by moment. I showed them the scars on my hands from the broken window. I explained the injury map I'd drawn on my arm. I described the feeling of being hunted in my own home by someone who was supposed to protect me. When the prosecutor showed the photos of the exterior deadbolt, several jurors looked physically sick. Marcus was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 7 years. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at me with those gray eyes, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. He was afraid of me, of what I'd done, of how I'd fought back and won. I'd turned his own methods against him, documenting everything, leaving evidence everywhere, creating an undeniable trail of truth. My father was released 2 years early on appeal. His assault charges reduced when the full story came out. The day he picked me up from my foster home, he looked older, grayer, worn down by prison and grief. But when he hugged me, he whispered that he was proud of me for surviving, for fighting, for never giving up even when the whole world seemed against me. We drove away from that life in silence, both of us carrying scars that would never fully heal. I'm 26 now, a social worker specializing in cases of child abuse and domestic violence. I teach survival tactics to teenagers who remind me of myself at 16, desperate and disbelieved. I show them how to document injuries, how to leave evidence trails, how to be their own advocates when the system fails them. Most importantly, I teach them that their truth matters, even when the adults in their lives are too broken or complicit to see it. Sometimes I still dream about those 3 days. The sound of the power drill, the feeling of the rope around my wrists, the taste of Marcus's blood in my mouth when I bit him. But I also dream about the moment I crashed through Mrs. Chen's door, bloody and desperate but alive. The moment I showed her my arm with its careful documentation. The moment she believed me. Because that's the thing about truth. It might take time. It might take evidence. It might take everything you have to fight for it. But truth, real truth, has a way of breaking through even the most carefully constructed lies. Every scar on my body tells a story. The thin white lines on my palms from grabbing broken glass. The puckered mark on my ankle from the rose thorns. The faint rope burns on my wrists that only show in certain light. But they're not just scars. They're proof. Proof that I survived. Proof that I fought back. proof that sometimes when you refuse to stop telling the truth, even when everyone wants you to be quiet, you can save your own life. Marcus thought he had 3 days to break me. What he didn't understand was that you can't break someone who's already figured out how to document their own destruction. You can't silence someone who's learned to hide evidence in places you'd never think to look. You can't disappear a girl who refuses to disappear quietly. He had 3 days, but I had the truth. And in the end, that was enough. The foster home where I spent the next 2 years was run by an older couple, Patricia and James Morrison, who'd seen enough damaged kids to know when to push and when to give space. Their house in Aurora was nothing special, a 3-bedroom ranch with dated wallpaper and creaky floors, but it was the first place I'd felt safe in longer than I could remember. Patricia never asked why I checked the locks 3 times before bed or why I couldn't sleep with my bedroom door closed. She just made sure I had a nightlight and a clear path to the bathroom. Those first weeks were the hardest. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., convinced I could hear a power drill starting up somewhere in the house. James would find me in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of water, my hands shaking too hard to hold it steady. He never said much, just sat with me until the sun came up, sometimes doing crossword puzzles, sometimes just being present. The silence was comfortable in a way I hadn't experienced before, not loaded with threats or manipulation. School was another challenge entirely. Westfield High was bigger than my old school, with metal detectors at the entrance and security guards who looked bored rather than vigilant. I kept my head down, did my work, avoided the questions that always came when people noticed the fading bruises on my arms. The guidance counselor, Ms. Rodriguez, tried to get me to open up in our mandatory sessions, but I'd learned that adults who said they wanted to help often made things worse. It wasn't until I met Danny in my English class that things started to change. She was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall in platform boots, with purple-streaked hair and a laugh that could fill a room. She'd been in the system longer than me, bouncing between homes since she was 8, and she had this way of making trauma seem survivable. We bonded over terrible cafeteria food and a shared hatred of group therapy, where well-meaning adults tried to get us to process our feelings with crafts and trust exercises. Danny was the first person I told about the evidence I'd left behind in that house. We were sitting on the bleachers after school, watching the track team practice, when I described the hair I'd tucked under the baseboard, the message scratched into the floor. She listened without interrupting, then showed me the cigarette burns on her shoulder from her biological mother. "We collect evidence on our bodies," she said, "whether we mean to or not. The trick is learning how to use it." The trial preparation was its own kind of torture. The prosecutor, Catherine Walsh, was brilliant but intense, drilling me on every detail until I could recite the timeline in my sleep. She explained how Marcus's defense attorney would try to discredit me, would bring up my father's conviction, would paint me as a troubled teen making false accusations for attention. We practiced my testimony over and over, with Catherine playing the defense attorney, asking increasingly hostile questions until I learned not to flinch. The hardest part was when they brought in the physical evidence. Seeing that exterior deadbolt in a clear plastic bag, knowing it had been removed from my bedroom door, made everything feel fresh again. Catherine had me identify each piece of evidence, explain its significance, relive those 3 days in excruciating detail. She warned me that Marcus would be in the courtroom, that he had the right to face his accuser, that I'd have to look at him while I testified. What she didn't warn me about was my mother being there. Sarah sat in the back row during my testimony, tears streaming down her face like she was the victim. Part of me wanted to comfort her, the little girl who still remembered bedtime stories and birthday cakes and the way she used to braid my hair before school. But a bigger part, the part that had survived those 3 days, felt nothing but cold observation. She'd made her choice. Now she had to live with the consequences. The defense attorney was exactly what Catherine had prepared me for. He questioned my mental health, brought up the divorce, suggested I'd fabricated evidence to get attention. He showed the jury photos of my father in handcuffs, tried to paint our family as violent and dysfunctional. But Catherine had prepared me well. I answered each question calmly, stuck to the facts, pointed out the inconsistencies in Marcus's story. When he suggested I'd installed the exterior lock myself to frame my stepfather, several jurors actually laughed. Marcus took the stand in his own defense, wearing a suit that made him look like a concerned suburban father. He spun a story about a troubled teenager who'd been acting out since her parents' divorce, who'd threatened to hurt herself if he didn't let her have her way. He claimed the exterior lock was for my own safety, that I'd been sneaking out at night, that he was just trying to protect me from myself. His voice never wavered, his gray eyes radiating sincerity. If I hadn't lived through the truth, I might have believed him myself. But then Catherine began her cross-examination, and Marcus's mask started to slip. She asked about the fake text messages, and he claimed they were real, that my mother had sent them. But when she pointed out that the metadata showed they'd been created on his phone, typed on his keyboard, he fumbled for an explanation. She asked about the voice recordings where he'd practiced different stories, and he said he'd been trying to figure out how to explain my behavior to concerned friends. Each lie required another lie to support it, and soon he was drowning in his own fabrications. The moment that broke him was when Catherine played one of his practice recordings for the jury. His voice filled the courtroom, rehearsing lies about my mental health, adjusting his tone to sound more convincing. I watched his face go pale as he heard himself saying, "Try it again. More concern in your voice when you mention her self-harm. Make it sound like you've been dealing with this for months." The jury looked at him with disgust, and I saw him realize he'd lost. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Just a hollow kind of relief, like finally putting down something heavy you'd been carrying too long. Marcus didn't look at me as they led him away in handcuffs. My mother fled the courtroom before the bailiff finished reading the verdict, and I sat there with Catherine and Patricia, who'd come to support me, feeling strangely empty. The nightmares lasted for months after the trial. Not about the violence or the fear, but about the moments of gaslighting, the times when everyone believed him instead of me. I'd dream about Mrs. Chen's sympathetic face as she helped him carry me back to the house. About the police driving away while I screamed for help. About my mother's slap in the car, the way she'd chosen him over me without hesitation. Patricia found me a therapist who specialized in trauma from family violence. Dr. Sarah Kim was nothing like the earnest counselors at school. She didn't want me to forgive or forget or move on. She wanted me to understand that what happened wasn't my fault, that surviving was an achievement, that my hypervigilance and trust issues were normal responses to abnormal situations. We spent months working through the complex grief of losing my mother to her own denial. During one session, I told Dr. Kim about the moment I'd decided to stop telling the truth, sitting in that courtroom watching my father get sentenced. She helped me understand that survival sometimes requires strategic dishonesty, that I'd done what I needed to do to get through an impossible situation. "The truth isn't always safe," she said. "Sometimes we have to hide it, document it, wait for the right moment to let it out. You didn't stop telling the truth. You just learned to be smart about when and how to tell it." I started visiting my father once a month after he got early release. Those visits were awkward at first, both of us changed by our experiences, trying to figure out how to be father and daughter again. He lived in a small apartment in Littleton, working construction and attending anger management classes as part of his parole. He never asked for details about those 3 days with Marcus, but I saw him clench his fists whenever the topic came near. One day, he told me about his time in prison, how he'd replayed that moment of beating Marcus over and over, wishing he'd done more damage. "I kept thinking if I'd just killed him," he said, "none of this would have happened to you. But then you wouldn't have had the chance to fight back, to prove what he really was. What you did took more courage than what I did. You fought him with truth instead of fists, and you won." Danny and I graduated high school together, both of us aging out of the system with a collection of survival skills most people never need. She went to community college for nursing, joking that she'd seen enough injuries to know how to treat them. I got a scholarship to the University of Denver for social work, determined to be the advocate I'd needed when no one believed me. College was where I first started telling my story publicly. It began in a women's studies class, discussing domestic violence and the ways abusers manipulate systems meant to protect victims. I raised my hand and found myself describing the exterior deadbolt, the fake text messages, the practiced lies. The room went silent, and I thought I'd shared too much. But after class, 3 different women approached me privately, sharing their own stories of not being believed. That's when I realized my story wasn't just mine. It belonged to every girl who'd been called a liar, every woman who'd been gaslit into doubting her own reality, every child whose truth was inconvenient for the adults around them. I started speaking at survivor support groups, sharing not just the trauma but the resistance, the ways I'd fought back with documentation and evidence and stubborn refusal to disappear. My junior year, I interned at a domestic violence shelter, working with children who'd witnessed abuse. I taught them games that were actually survival skills, like hiding important things in unlikely places, memorizing phone numbers of safe adults, creating code words with trusted friends. The shelter director, Mariana, had her own history of childhood abuse. She understood why I checked exits whenever I entered a room, why I always sat facing the door. One night, we had a 12-year-old girl come in with her mother, both of them fleeing an abusive father. The girl, Sophia, reminded me so much of myself at that age, watchful and too wise, already calculating which adults were safe. While her mother filled out paperwork, I sat with Sophia and taught her the trick with pulling out hair strands to leave DNA evidence. Her eyes went wide and she asked if it really worked. I showed her the faint scars on my palms and told her it had saved my life. Working at the shelter taught me that survival looks different for everyone. Some women fought back physically. Some disappeared in the middle of the night with nothing but their children and the clothes on their backs. Some spent years documenting abuse before finding the courage to leave. But all of them had found ways to resist, even when resistance seemed impossible. Their stories became part of my understanding of what strength really looks like. My senior year, I was asked to speak at a conference for law enforcement about recognizing signs of domestic imprisonment. I stood in front of a room full of police officers and detectives, describing how Marcus had manipulated the welfare check, how he'd used the blaring TV to drown out my screams for help. I explained the psychology of coercive control, how abusers create alternate realities where victims seem crazy for telling the truth. After my presentation, Detective Reeves approached me. He'd been promoted to head of the domestic violence unit and wanted to know if I'd consider consulting on cases involving teenage victims. He said my case had changed how he approached welfare checks, made him look harder for signs of hidden abuse. It felt surreal, being asked to help the same system that had almost failed me. But I said yes. If my experience could help one kid be believed, it was worth it. The consulting work was harder than I'd expected. Reading case files brought back memories I thought I'd processed. Seeing crime scene photos of bedroom doors with exterior locks made my hands shake. But it also felt like closing a circle, using my worst experience to prevent others from going through the same thing. I developed training materials for officers, teaching them to look for unusual locks, to check if windows could open, to listen for what wasn't being said. One case in particular stuck with me. A 15-year-old boy whose stepmother had installed cameras in his room, claiming he was stealing from her. The responding officers initially believed her story about needing to monitor a troubled teen. But something in the boy's desperate insistence reminded me of my own frantic attempts to be heard. I suggested they check if the cameras were actually recording or just there for intimidation. They were fake, just like Marcus's security camera. The boy broke down crying when they told him someone finally believed him. After graduating with my master's in social work, I took a job with the Department of Human Services, specifically requesting to work in the unit that investigates child abuse in middle-class families. These were the cases most likely to be dismissed, where abusers knew how to present well, where victims were labeled as dramatic or attention-seeking. My supervisor warned me about burnout, about the emotional toll of seeing my own story reflected in case after case. But I'd learned to channel trauma into purpose. Every time I validated a child's experience, every time I documented evidence others might miss, every time I pushed back against assumptions about good families, I felt like I was reaching back through time to help my 16-year-old self. The girl who'd scratched messages under her dresser, who'd drawn injury maps on her skin, who'd refused to stop fighting even when no one believed her. I developed a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession. I checked every lock in a house, tested every window, looked for scratches in hidden places. Other caseworkers sometimes rolled their eyes at my methods, but my cases held up in court. Defense attorneys learned they couldn't shake me on the stand, that I'd documented everything too carefully for them to create reasonable doubt. 5 years into my career, I received a letter forwarded through the prosecutor's office. It was from Marcus, writing from prison. He wanted me to know he'd found religion, that he was sorry for what he'd done, that he hoped I could forgive him someday. I read it once, then filed it away with other case documents. Forgiveness wasn't mine to give. He'd have to live with what he'd done, just like I had to live with what had been done to me. My mother tried to reconnect when Marcus was released on parole after serving 5 of his 7 years. She sent letters through my father, since I wouldn't give her my address. She wrote about therapy, about understanding how she'd failed me, about wanting to rebuild our relationship. I read each letter carefully, looking for accountability beyond the self-pity. But every sentence was about her pain, her guilt, her journey. Never about the child she'd left locked in a house with a predator. I wrote back once, a single paragraph explaining that I'd grieved the mother I'd needed and accepted the mother I'd had. That I wished her well in her healing but couldn't be part of it. That my forgiveness, if it ever came, would be for my own peace, not her absolution. I mailed it on a Tuesday afternoon and felt lighter walking away from the post office, like I'd finally closed a door I'd been holding open for years. The work continued to be hard. There were cases I couldn't save. Children returned to dangerous homes because the evidence wasn't quite enough. There were nights I came home and cried in my shower, washing away the day's failures. But there were also victories. Kids removed from harmful situations. Abusers held accountable. Families rebuilt on foundations of truth instead of lies. I started dating in my late 20s, which came with its own challenges. How do you explain to someone that you need to sleep with your bedroom door cracked open? That certain sounds make you flinch? That trust is something you meter out in careful doses? Most people couldn't handle the weight of my history, wanted me to be always over it in a way that fit their timeline. But then I met Alex at a conference on trauma-informed care. Alex was a paramedic who'd seen enough to understand that some wounds never fully heal. They didn't ask why I checked the locks or why I kept a spare phone charger in every room. On our third date, I told them about the 3 days, and they listened without trying to fix or minimize or compare. When I was done, they simply asked what I needed them to know to help me feel safe. It was the first time someone had responded to my trauma with practical compassion instead of pity or discomfort. We moved in together after a year, negotiating space and safety in ways that would seem strange to most couples. Separate bedrooms with doors that locked from the inside. A security system I could monitor from my phone. Clear communication about triggers and boundaries. Alex never made me feel broken for needing these things, understanding that they were the architecture of survival I'd built to function in a world that had once betrayed me. The panic attacks started when I turned 30, seemingly out of nowhere. I'd be grocery shopping or sitting in traffic, and suddenly I'd be 16 again, trapped in that room, listening to Marcus's footsteps in the hall. Dr. Kim called it an anniversary reaction, my body remembering trauma on its own timeline. We worked through it with EMDR and somatic therapy, teaching my nervous system that the danger had passed, that I'd survived and built a life worth living. Through it all, I kept working with kids who reminded me of myself, teaching them to trust their instincts, to document everything, to never stop fighting for their truth to be heard. Some of them came back years later, adults now, to tell me how those skills had saved them. Others disappeared into the system, and I could only hope the seeds I'd planted would bloom when they needed them most. I testified in Marcus's parole hearing when I was 32. He looked smaller than I remembered, gray-haired and hollow-eyed, talking about rehabilitation and remorse. I spoke about the lasting impact of those 3 days, the ripple effects that touched every aspect of my life. Not to keep him in prison, but to make sure the board understood the full weight of his choices. They denied his parole, noting the calculated nature of his crimes, the preparation that showed intent rather than impulse. My father walked me out of the hearing, still protective after all these years. We went for coffee afterward, sitting in comfortable silence that had replaced our earlier awkwardness. He told me he was proud of the work I did, of the person I'd become despite everything. I told him that his belief in me, even when it cost him 5 years of his life, had given me the foundation to fight back. We were both crying by the end, 2 survivors recognizing each other's scars. Now, at 35, I run a nonprofit called Zeroers Document and Survive. teaching documentation strategies to abuse victims. We distribute tiny cameras, show people how to hide evidence, create safe communication networks for those still trapped. Every workshop starts with my story, with the exterior deadbolt and the glass shards and the refusal to disappear quietly. I watch recognition dawn on faces, see people realize they're not crazy, that their truth matters even when no one believes it. The scar on my palm from the broken window has faded to a thin white line you can only see in certain light. But when I'm teaching a scared teenager how to create evidence trails, I show it to them like a badge of honor. This saved my life, I tell them. Your truth, documented and preserved and stubbornly insisted upon, can save yours too. Because Marcus was wrong about so many things, but especially about this. 3 days wasn't enough to break someone who'd already decided to survive. I think about those 3 days often, not with the sharp pain of fresh trauma, but with the complex emotions of processed experience. They were the worst 3 days of my life, but they were also the crucible that forged who I became. Every moment of terror, every small act of resistance, every piece of evidence I left behind, built the foundation of my survival and my purpose. Sometimes I dream not of the trauma, but of the triumph, of Mrs. Chen opening her door and believing me, of the police taking photos of the exterior lock, of Catherine Walsh playing Marcus's practice recordings for the jury, of the moment the verdict was read and justice, imperfect but real, was served. These dreams wake me not with terror but with gratitude for the 16-year-old girl who refused to give up, who turned her body into evidence and her truth into a weapon. The work continues. Every day brings new cases, new children trapped by adults who should protect them. But also, every day brings new possibilities for intervention, for belief, for justice. I carry my story not as a burden, but as a tool, using it to wedge open doors for others, to create space for truth in systems designed to maintain comfortable lies. Because that's what survival taught me. That truth, documented and insisted upon and refused to be silenced, is the most powerful force in the world. Marcus thought he had 3 days to break me. He had the locks, the lies, the power that comes with being the adult everyone believes. But I had something stronger. I had the stubborn refusal to accept his reality over mine. I had the ingenuity to turn my prison into a crime scene. I had the desperate creativity of someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He had 3 days, but I had the truth. And in the end, the truth was enough to save my life and build a future worth living. Looking back now from the safety of decades past, I can see how those 3 days created ripples that touched every shore of my existence. My work with Document and Survive has helped hundreds of victims create evidence trails that led to their freedom. We've partnered with law enforcement agencies across 3 states to train officers in recognizing sophisticated abuse tactics. The exterior deadbolt that trapped me has become a symbol in our training materials, a reminder that abuse doesn't always look like bruises and broken bones. Last month, I received an email that stopped me in my tracks. It was from Sophia, the 12-year-old girl I'd met at the shelter all those years ago. She's 24 now, just graduated from law school, planning to become a prosecutor specializing in domestic violence cases. She wrote that the hair-pulling trick I'd taught her had saved her life when her father violated the restraining order. The DNA evidence under her bathroom baseboard had been crucial in sending him to prison. She wanted me to know that my story had become part of hers, woven into the fabric of her survival. These connections, these threads between survivors across time and space, form a network stronger than any lock, any lie, any attempt to silence us. Every person who learns to document their truth, who refuses to accept gaslighting as reality, who fights back with evidence and determination, adds another strand to this web of resistance. We are not isolated victims, but a community of warriors, each battle scar a lesson passed forward to those still fighting. The nonprofit has grown beyond what I ever imagined. We have a staff of 15 now, all survivors who turned their trauma into purpose. Our youngest volunteer is 18, fresh out of foster care with her own story of documentation saving her life. Our oldest is 72, a grandmother who escaped after 40 years of marriage when she finally learned it was never too late to gather evidence and seek freedom. Together, we form an unlikely army, bound not by our wounds, but by our refusal to let those wounds define our limits. Alex and I married last spring in a small ceremony at Patricia and James's house. My foster parents, now in their 70s, still providing safe harbor for kids who need it most. My father walked me down their backyard aisle, both of us crying happy tears for the life I'd built from the ashes of our shared trauma. Even Mrs. Chen was there, 91 and still sharp, whispering that she should have seen the signs, that she'd never forgive herself for not believing me sooner. I told her what I've told so many others. We can't change the past, but we can change how we respond to the present. The speech I gave at our reception wasn't about love conquering all or happily ever after. It was about choosing a partner who understood that some doors would always need to stay cracked open, that some sounds would always make me flinch. That trust was a daily practice rather than a permanent state. Alex responded with vows that acknowledged my history without making it my entire identity, promising to be my soft landing when the nightmares came, and my fierce advocate when the world tried to minimize what I'd survived. Dr. Kim retired last year, but we still exchange emails. She wrote recently that my case had changed how she approached therapy with trauma survivors, that my insistence on documenting everything had shown her a form of resistance she hadn't recognized before. She's writing a book now about evidence-based survival strategies, and she asked if she could include my story. I said yes, with the condition that she emphasize not just the trauma, but the ingenuity. Not just the victimization, but the victory. The book I'm writing myself is almost finished. It's part memoir, part survival guide, part love letter to every girl who's been called a liar for telling the truth. Each chapter includes practical strategies hidden within the narrative, teaching through story rather than instruction. How to create evidence trails that can't be dismissed. How to recognize gaslighting and resist its reality-warping effects. How to find allies in unexpected places. How to turn your body into a witness when no one else will testify on your behalf. Publishers initially wanted me to soften the story, to add more healing, more forgiveness, more of the redemption arc that makes readers comfortable. But comfort isn't what survivors need. They need the messy truth that healing isn't linear, that some wounds leave permanent marks, that you can build a beautiful life without pretending the ugly parts didn't happen. So I kept the rage alongside the recovery, the setbacks alongside the successes, the full spectrum of what survival actually looks like. My mother died 2 years ago, alone in the same house where everything happened. My father called to tell me, his voice careful and neutral, giving me space to feel whatever I needed to feel. I went to the funeral, not for her, but for the girl I'd been, the daughter who'd deserved protection and got abandonment instead. I stood at her grave and finally said the words I'd carried for 20 years. I survived you too. Then I left and never looked back. Marcus is still alive, still in prison, still sending letters I don't read. The parole board sends me notices every few years, and I submit my impact statements without fail. Not from vengeance, but from vigilance, making sure the system remembers what he's capable of when given access to vulnerable children. He's become smaller in my mind over the years, shrinking from monster to merely a damaged man who chose to damage others. The power he had over me for those 3 days has transformed into the power I have to keep him from hurting anyone else. The house on Maple Street was demolished last year to make way for condos. I drove by the day they tore it down, watching the walls that had trapped me crumble into dust. The room where I'd been locked, the bathroom window I'd escaped through, the kitchen where Marcus had cleaned my wounds while planning worse. All of it reduced to rubble and hauled away. But the evidence I'd hidden, the messages scratched in wood and the hair tucked in corners, had already done their work. The house was just walls. The truth I'd insisted on was the foundation that remained. Some days, the work feels too heavy. Another child failed by the system. Another carefully documented case dismissed for lack of concrete proof. Another survivor giving up because the mountain of disbelief feels too high to climb. On those days, I go to my office wall where I keep a photo of the exterior deadbolt, still in its evidence bag, labeled with my case number. I remind myself that this piece of hardware, meant to imprison me, became the key evidence that set me free. That every impossible situation contains the seeds of its own solution if we're brave enough to look for them. The workshops continue, spreading across the country now through video conferences and trained facilitators. Last week, a girl in Montana used our techniques to document abuse by her coach, hiding evidence in places he never thought to check. A boy in Florida created a paper trail that exposed his uncle's grooming behavior. A woman in Maine gathered 5 years of evidence before safely leaving her husband. Each success story joins the constellation of survivors who refuse to be silenced, who turned their truth into armor and their documentation into weapons. I still check locks, still sit facing doors, still keep backup plans for my backup plans. These aren't symptoms of unhealed trauma, but tools of a well-earned vigilance. Alex understands when I need to walk through the house before bed, making sure every window latch is secure. Our future children will grow up knowing that safety is something we create through awareness and preparation, not something we assume through naive trust. They'll learn age-appropriate ways to protect themselves, to trust their instincts, to never let anyone convince them their truth isn't real. The speaking engagements have taken me places I never imagined. Congressional hearings on improving child protection laws, international conferences on trauma-informed investigation techniques, university classrooms where future social workers learn to look beyond surface presentations. Each time I tell my story, it becomes both smaller and larger. Smaller because it's just one story among millions. Larger because each telling creates more space for other stories to be heard and believed. Sometimes young survivors ask me if it gets easier, if the memories fade, if they'll ever feel normal again. I tell them the truth. The memories don't disappear, but they lose their sharp edges. The hypervigilance softens from panic to preparation. Normal is a setting on a washing machine, not a goal for trauma survivors. What they can have instead is a life rich with purpose, connection, and the deep strength that comes from surviving what others said would break them. The irony isn't lost on me that Marcus's attempt to silence me gave me a voice that reaches thousands. His 3 days of imprisonment led to my lifetime of teaching others to break free. Every lock he installed became evidence. Every lie he told revealed the truth. Every moment he thought he was breaking me, I was building the case that would convict him. He never understood that teenage girls are underestimated at society's peril, that we survive things that would destroy grown men, that our supposed weakness is actually our hidden strength. I think of all the girls like me, locked in rooms both literal and metaphorical, told their truth is madness, their resistance is rebellion, their survival instincts are symptoms of mental illness. I think of them scratching messages in hidden places, pulling out hair to leave DNA, drawing injury maps on their skin, turning their bodies into crime scenes because no one will believe their words. I think of them reading my story, our story, the story of every survivor who refused to disappear quietly and knowing they're not alone. The truth is a powerful thing. It can be buried, twisted, denied, and ignored, but it can never be completely destroyed. It leaves traces in scratched wood and hidden hair, in documented injuries and recorded lies, in the memories of survivors who refuse to forget. Marcus thought he could control the truth by controlling me. He thought 3 days would be enough to rewrite reality in his favor. He thought a teenage girl's word would never stand against an adult man's performance. He was wrong about everything, but especially about this. The truth doesn't need to be believed to be real. It just needs to be preserved, documented, insisted upon until the world can no longer deny it. Every survivor who reads this knows what I mean. We are the keepers of inconvenient truths, the archivists of our own destruction and resurrection, the evidence that refuses to stay buried. My name is Emily Chen Morrison. I was 16 when my stepfather locked me in my bedroom for 3 days. I survived by turning my imprisonment into evidence, my body into a witness, my truth into a weapon he never saw coming. This is my story, but it's also yours, and theirs, and ours. Every word is true, every detail preserved, every moment proof that we survive. We remember. We refuse to let anyone rewrite our reality. Marcus thought he had 3 days to break me. But I had something he never counted on, something more powerful than locks or lies or the weight of adult authority. I had the truth, and the stubborn determination to preserve it no matter what. I had the ingenuity of the desperate and the creativity of the trapped. I had the legacy of every survivor who came before me and the responsibility to those who would come after. He had 3 days, I have a lifetime. And I choose to spend it making sure no child ever has to prove their truth alone in the dark again. Because that's what survival looks like. Not just making it through, but making it matter. Not just escaping the room, but tearing down the walls for everyone still trapped inside. Not just telling the truth, but teaching others how to make their truth impossible to ignore. The girl who scratched desperate messages under her dresser has become a woman who teaches survival strategies to thousands. The evidence I hid in terror has become curriculum in police academies. The 3 days that were meant to break me became the foundation of a life devoted to breaking cycles of abuse. That's the ultimate victory, the final truth that no lock can contain. We survive, we thrive, and we transform our worst moments into weapons against the darkness that tried to consume us. This is my story. This is our story. This is the story of everyone who refuses to let their truth be locked away. And it will never end as long as there are survivors brave enough to document, resist, and insist on being believed. 3 days. A lifetime. An eternity of voices rising together, impossible to silence, impossible to ignore, impossible to lock away ever again.